They're gonna shoot me out of the sky. But if they do, get me out of there because I know too much." And so with that kind of dramatic flair, Lieutenant Colonel Isil Gene Hambleton took off in his AC-1HN-6 gunship on a mission over Vietnam. But soon after he did, a surface-to-air missile streaked across his path and detonated against the transport plane, sending it plummeting toward the jungle floor. It was April 1965, and Gene found himself in a desperate fight for survival against not only the elements, but also one of the most cunning and brutal enemies in history. He parachuted from the crippled aircraft and landed safely in what appeared to be an abandoned patch of jungle. But it was unlong before he was discovered by a group of hostile locals who promptly shoved a gun in his face. Now, although he'd sustained some injuries from the landing, he quickly recovered enough to overpower his captor and escape into the thick foliage. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. You see, Lieutenant Colonel Hambleton was no ordinary pilot. He was one of the USS leading experts in electronic warfare. And during his service in Vietnam, he'd been responsible for developing new ways to jam enemy radar systems. But this expertise made him a valuable asset to the North Vietnamese Army, who now wanted to interrogate him about America's latest developments in weapons technology. So when he was captured, it triggered the largest and most complex search and rescue operation of the entire Vietnam War. But even though it was the height of the war, American officials decided to keep Gene's capture under wraps. Which is why, despite being shot down just 2 months earlier, he had already been listed as missing in action for almost a year. And while nobody knew where he was, his wife Pat was convinced that he was still alive. She didn't realize that the NVA knew exactly where he was. They'd taken him to one of their most secure prison camps in Hanoi, and they were determined to make him talk. His guards dragged him through the jungle, forcing him to walk barefoot over sharp rocks and broken glass. But the most painful part was when they tied his feet together and forced him to hop on one foot at a time until he eventually collapsed in exhaustion. Then they slapped him across the face, lifted him up, and carried him away to a cave where they threw him into a dark hole, jammed full of other captured U.S. servicemen. All they told him was that he'd be staying here for a long, long time. At first, he couldn't even see, but after his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that the cave was actually a vast underground city, complete with cells, barracks, and even an execution chamber. And as if the dim oil lamp lighting the room wasn't creepy enough, every surface was covered with graffiti left by previous inmates. There were pictures of dead soldiers, references to American presidents, and pleas to God to bring them home. And then there was the writing that chilled Gene to the bone. It read, "If you are brave, kill yourself." Now, this was how the Viet Cong tested their prisoners for insanity. And even though he was scared, Gene knew he had to stay strong. He tried to cheer up the men around him by telling them stories about his life back in the States. But all it did was remind them of everything they were missing out on. Some of them started crying, which made Gene feel guilty and even more determined to get them all out of there. But it wasn't easy. He befriended a man named Major Bud Day, who'd been imprisoned there for almost 2 years. But even he was starting to lose hope. "We don't have much time left," he said. "Christmas will be here soon, and if we aren't out by then, they'll forget all about us." Now, Christmas was 3 months away, and the odds of rescue seemed slim. But Gene refused to give up. Instead, he kept busy by working on an escape plan. Every night when the guards would go home, he and the other U.S. servicemen would meet up in the courtyard and dig tunnels with spoons fashioned from a sharpened toothbrush. But they never went very far because the ground was incredibly hard. Then one day, Gene came up with an idea. He noticed that the guards always broke for lunch between 12 and 1 o'clock, so he proposed they start digging during that time instead. At first, everyone thought it was crazy. It would mean tunneling only 2 hours a day, but it was their only chance. So they spent weeks perfecting their system. Every morning, they'd cover up the tunnel entrance with leaves and branches. Once the guards left for lunch, they'd creep out and start digging with small hand tools hidden under their clothes. As soon as the guards returned, they'd have to hide again, leaving the hole covered in leaves. And this went on for months. Finally, on October 1965, just 2 days before Christmas, one of the men broke through to freedom. It was Air Force Captain Jim Johnson. But when he emerged from the ground, he immediately tripped and set off an alarm. Within seconds, armed soldiers surrounded him and hauled him back inside, screaming that there was an American mole in their midst. For the next few days, the guards searched the prison for the tunnel, all the while beating the men and throwing them back in the cave. But they never found the entrance. And when Christmas came, they gave up and sent most of the prisoners back to their cells. However, they kept Jim Johnson, along with 4 others, including Gene, in the courtyard as bargaining chips in case there was a prisoner swap. But little did they know, rescue was much closer than they thought. Over the next 2 weeks, more and more U.S. servicemen began to disappear from their cells. The North Vietnamese took them out one by one in exchange for bags of cash dropped by American bombers. And as soon as word got back to Washington, they began planning their own prisoner exchange. The operation would involve a massive covert team of 300 U.S. soldiers led by Navy SEALs and Air Force parachutists, whose job it was to sneak into the jungle and grab the POWs before the North Vietnamese could take them further inland. But things didn't go according to plan. When the rescue team arrived, they found that the POW camp had already been abandoned. Somehow the news of the raid had gotten out and the NVA had fled with their prisoners, leaving nothing but an empty hut and a pile of discarded uniforms. It looked like all hope was lost, but Gene had an idea. While he'd been imprisoned, he'd studied maps dropped by American planes, memorizing everything he could about the surrounding terrain. And now he used this knowledge to lead his captors deep into the jungle. He hoped they'd eventually get lost and leave him behind. At which point, he'd define his way to safety and alert the Americans of the NVA's new location. But this was easier said than done. The North Vietnamese weren't going to let him out of their sight. They marched him deeper and deeper into the jungle, crossing rivers, scaling mountains, and sleeping by the roadside. And all the while, he was losing hope that he'd ever escape. Then one day, while taking a break from marching, he noticed a farmer tending to his crops. Even though he couldn't understand the man's language, he pointed to his mouth and pretended to eat, hoping to convey that he was hungry. And much to his surprise, the man understood. He led Gene to his house, gave him food and water, then showed him a stash of clothes hidden in the trees. Gene put on a pair of pants and a shirt, tied a towel around his head as a makeshift hat. And once he was presentable, he asked a man to draw a picture of where he was. The farmer obliged and drew a map showing a river, a mountain, and a small village nearby. It was all the information Gene needed to make his move. That night, he slipped away from his captors and walked downstream until he saw the exact mountain drawn on the map. From there, he made his way uphill, jumping from rock to rock, until he heard the welcome sound of rushing water. And as he rounded a bend, he spotted a small clearing. In the center sat an American helicopter with its searchlight turned on, sweeping the trees for anyone who needed help. In that moment, Gene felt like he'd just won the lottery. He waved his arms and shouted, "Hey, over here, come and get me." And within seconds, the chopper swooped down and lifted him into the cabin. As they flew away from the jungle, he looked back at the clearing. The helicopter had landed in a perfect circular shape, just like those depicted in the maps dropped by American planes. In other words, it was a signal for extraction, and someone at headquarters had been watching out for him. When the helicopter touched down at the base, Gene learned that he'd been gone for 8 months, and the whole time his wife Pat had been tirelessly campaigning for his release. She'd met with politicians, given interviews, and done everything she could to keep her husband's name in the public eye. But Gene was grateful to be home. Later, he and his fellow rescued POWs would go on to star in a movie about their harrowing experiences called Bat 21. But it was a difficult shoot. Gene clashed with the producers over creative differences, and the studio executives didn't like how violent the finished product turned out. To this day, the film has never been released in its entirety. But it does really matter, because the real story of Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Hambright is one that will live on forever. Now check out the incredible true story of the last US soldier left behind in Vietnam, or click this other video instead.